Now that we've got our user profile function deployed and our API ready to go, we need some way to authenticate and authorize users. We're going to create something called a custom authorizer, and that does exactly that. It sits between your API gateway and your Lambda function, and it makes sure that people who are making requests to these endpoints actually have access and are allowed to call these endpoints. Now, before we create this function, we're going to create another IAM role for this function because it doesn't need as much permissions as our current Lambda functions. It doesn't need to use the transcoder whatsoever. So we're going to go back to our AWS console. We're going to click on Services. We are going to click on IAM under Security, Identity, and Compliance. We'll click on the Roles section. Create Role. Make sure AWS Service is ticked. And we're going to click on Lambda because we want our Lambda function to assume this role. Click on Next Permissions. And this time we're only going to give it one permission. Lambda execute. Tick. And click on Next Review. Give the role a name. We're going to name it API Gateway Lambda Exec Role. And click on Create Role. If we click into the role that we just created, we can see that we've only got the single policy attached to it to execute Lambda functions, and that's all we need for our current function. Now, before we deploy this Lambda function, we actually need to package it up like we did previously. So open a terminal in the lab3 directory. So I've opened my terminal in the lab3 directory, and if we just list out the directory at the moment, we're going to change into the Lambda folder and list it out again. And we're going to change into the custom authorizer directory. If we list the directory as is, we can see we've got the same 3 files as we did for every other Lambda function we've deployed. So as usual, we're just going to run npm install to install all the dependencies in the package.json file. And if we ls one more time, we should see the node modules directory. And there it is. Now we need to package our function so we can upload it to Lambda. We're going to type npm run pre-deploy. And if you're on Windows, just do the steps that we did in Lab 1. And we're just going to ls one more time, just to make sure that the lambda-deployment.zip file is there, which we can see it is. Now let's hop back into the AWS console. From where we left off last time, let's go to Services at the top. We're going to click on Lambda under Compute. Now we're going to click on the Create Function button. Make sure Author from Scratch is selected. And we're going to give our function a name. We're just going to call it Custom Authorizer. Leave the runtime as Node.js 6.10. And in the existing role section, we're going to select our new role that we just made. Once that's all done, click on Create Function. Now we want to upload this code, so let's scroll down until we get to the function code section. We're going to select Upload a zip file. Then we're just going to select the zip file for our custom authorizer. Leave the rest as is, and scroll down to basic settings. We're going to set the timeout to 30 seconds. Now we're going to scroll up to the environment variables section, and this function only needs one environment variable. Auth0 domain. We're going to go back to our Auth0 dashboard, copy our domain name, and we're going to pop it into the value. Scroll up to the top and click on Save. Now that our custom authorizer is saved, let's go through the code and see how it works. Now before we get into this, please don't stress out if you don't understand how this works. It's not really necessary. It's more just for your own information to see how this function authenticates users. So let's scroll down to the handler. And we can see a few things already. First of all, it expects an event and an authorization token in that event. If it's not found, it's going to return an error. Second, we're going to pull out the JWT token from the event as long as it's there, and we're going to grab the second half of it. So if it's something like bearer and then some random numbers. We're going to grab this side of it. If there is no JWT token, again, we're going to call back with an error. Now that we have our token, we can actually decode the JWT using a JWT package library and the decode method, which we're pulling in up the top here. The next step is we check our environment variables for the auth0 domain. And if we don't have one, again, we call back with an error. These are the three main things that we need for this custom authorizer to work. Now, if we go down just a little bit further, we can see that we use our auth0 API URL to get something called a JWKS JSON file. And this is a public file. JWKS stands for JSON Web Key Set. It contains a set of JSON Web Keys, or JWK. When we get a response, we're grabbing the first key out of the JWKS. We're making sure that we've actually got one. Then we're checking that the algorithm that was used to calculate our token is the same as the one that we've got in our token, since we've decoded our token already. If they don't match up, then the algorithm that was used is different. The way that the JWT is calculated with RS-256 is that a private key file is used to create the JWT, and then we can actually decode it with a public key, which is what we're trying to do here. Next, we make sure that the JWKS key that we have, the key identifier, matches the same key identifier in our token that we've received. Again, if they don't, throw an error. Finally, we're grabbing our public key from our JWK, and we're returning that to the next function here, called verify JWT token. So we've just built a public key, and we're going to verify what we've currently got against this public key. So let's go up to this method. And we can see we're calling the JWT package verify method, passing in these two fields. This will verify whether the public key can decode the token or not, using the algorithm RS-256. So that's going to return either a resolve or a reject if it didn't work. So let's go down. If we were able to decode our JWT token, then we can move on to the next function, which allows us to generate a policy to allow the user to invoke using this method ARN. If anything goes wrong, for example, one of these don't match up or the authorization failed, then it'll be caught in this catch block here. And it'll say that the failed JWT verification with the authorization token for debugging. Now let's go to this generate policy method here. And what this is doing is it's building a policy that's going to be returned to the API gateway, allowing it to invoke a particular function. We're building it with the effect, which is allow, and the resource, which is the method that we want to call. Then we're returning the policy document for the API gateway to use. And that's it. That's how this function works. So this is how the authentication section of our website will verify users to make sure that they can call the functions and they are who they say they are. Now that we know how the custom authorizer works, we can apply it to the API gateway. Let's go back to the AWS console, go to services up the top, and we're going to click on API gateway under networking and content delivery. Click on the ACG serverless for beginners API, and then we're going to click on authorizers in the sidebar. Let's create a new authorizer. We need to give it a name. I'm just going to call mine custom authorizer. We're going to leave the type as Lambda. We're going to make sure that it's in the US to East 1 region. And then we're going to select the Lambda function that's going to be our custom authorizer, which is also called custom authorizer. I'm going to leave the execution role as is. Make sure that the event payload is in the token. And as the token source, we're going to call it authorization. Keep everything else as is and click on create. Make sure that you click on grant and create because this allows API gateway to invoke the custom authorizer. Perfect, so our custom authorizer is now created. The next step is we need to tell the API gateway which resources we want to use this custom authorizer. So let's click on resources in the sidebar. We're going to click on get under user profile. Then we're going to click on method request. And we're going to select the authorizer that we just created. So click on this little pencil next to authorization. And we're going to select our custom authorizer. Now this is important. If it doesn't show up here, don't worry. just refresh the page. Let's click back on method request and try again. And there it is. Now let's click on the little tick next to it just to make sure it sets it. Next, we're passing two more things through to this custom authorizer. The first one is a query string called access token, so we need to specify that in this method. Click on add query string, and then we're going to call it access token. And make sure you click on the plus at the side here. Next, we're expecting something called authorization in the header, so we need to set that as well. And again, make sure that you click on the little tick. And that's it. That's all we need to do to use our custom authorizer. Now the last thing we need to do is deploy our API again. So let's click on Actions, Deploy API, make sure we select Dev, and then click Deploy. And there we have it, Cloud Gurus. Our API is deployed with our custom authorizer and our new method.